Hello, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you to the first of what's going to be a series of events this afternoon on wildfires and health, hosted by CAFE. For those who may not know, CAFE is the BU and Harvard Climate and Health Research Coordinating Center. And I'm Rachel Nethery. I'm a CAFE team member based at the Harvard School of Public Health. Just a quick overview of our agenda for the afternoon. From now until about 2:50 p.m., we'll be hosting a wildfire and health expert panel, and Yang Liu from Emory will be leading that panel. From 3 to 4:45, we'll have a series of lightning talks that will be hosted by Colleen Reed. And then from 4 to 4:45, in parallel with the second half of the lightning talks, we'll have a workshop session on mapping wildfire exposure data hosted by Fear and Rapid. So hopefully you guys are able to stick with us for most of the afternoon. We're really looking forward to these sessions. I think we're going to go ahead and kick off our first session, the expert panel. Again, our host for this panel is going to be Dr. Yang Liu. He's the chair and Gangarosa Distinguished Professor in the Department of Environmental Health at the Rollins School of Public Health of Emory University. And his research interests include satellite aerosol retrieval and product design, applications of satellite remote sensing in public health research, climate and health, and machine learning and spatial statistics. And over the past 16 years, Dr. Liu has led many federally funded projects to apply satellite data in air pollution exposure and health effects modeling, and to study the health impacts of climate change related to extreme weather, wildfires, pollen, and ambient air pollution. So thanks so much for hosting this panel, Dr. Liu. Looking forward to it. I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce the panel and the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion titled Wildfires and Health from Research to Resilience. It's my pleasure to moderate this panel. As we all know, this is a timely discussion. Wildfires in recent decades have become more frequent, more intense, and they're more widespread. Smoke in particular can travel hundreds of thousands of kilometers across state borders and national borders, right? So smoke can reach people who in life may have never seen a real fire, but they will, or they could, experience the adverse health outcome because of the smoke exposure. So what used to be a kind of a regional air pollution concern has become a global public health issue. And over the past several years, our scientific understanding has expanded rapidly. We have learned a lot about the chemical complexity of smoke and its short-term health effects, such as respiratory illnesses, mental health issues such as anxiety and depression disorders, and adverse birth outcomes. And we are beginning to understand the long-term health consequences as well, such as cardiovascular diseases, cognitive decline, and even premature death. And with the advances in satellite observations, chemical transport modeling, and epidemiological approaches, we now can better separate the impact from fire smoke from other pollution sources. And these new techniques give us a better understanding of the vulnerable populations, and then give us more opportunities to connect our science with public health decision making. And we understand that wildfires are not only a natural disaster. It's not only a public health or safety issue. It's not only a climate problem. It's all of the above. So the nature of this challenge requires us to think across different disciplines and different spatial temporal scales. And today we have a great panel of experts. Collectively, their work spans climate change, exposure assessment, epidemiology, and public health policy and practice. I hope that through their presentations and our Q&A sessions, we will not only talk about what we already know, but also identify knowledge gaps and ways to translate our research findings to actions in order to build up community resilience. So I'm looking forward to the engaging discussion to follow. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Minghao Qiu. Minghao, you there? Awesome. Dr. Qiu is an assistant professor at Stony Brook University, jointly appointed between the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences and the program in Public Health. He studies how extreme weather, such as wildfires and droughts, influence air quality and human health. Minghao, take it away.
All right. Well, can everybody hear me okay?
We're good.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Yang, for the nice introduction and for setting up the stage. And thank you to Cafe for inviting me to be part of this important discussion. So next slide, please. So in my talk today, I'll be mostly focusing on assessing population level wildfire smoke exposure and the health impacts, specifically looking at the recent historical trends. How has wildfire smoke influenced our air quality and health burden, and then looking ahead at future climate, projecting its levels and burden under future climate scenarios. So mostly I'll be focusing on the US. Next slide, please. So I'll be talking about a few papers that are participated in, some led by me and my groups, some led by my collaborators. So they're listed here, and thank the funding agencies for support those work. Specifically, I would like to thank Cafe and GeoCafe. So I'm honored to be the first cohort of GeoCafe, and that has helped tremendously in helping me communicating our research to a broad academic and policy audience. Next slide, please. So for this audience, this probably goes without saying, and Dr. Liu has set up the stage quite well. Wildfires are increasing in the US, and it's not only in the Western US where it often makes the news headlines, but really across the country as well. Next slide, please. So here are, next one, please. Here are two figures showing that, sorry, one more back. Yeah, so here are two figures showing, so on the left hand, this is the percent of forests burned in Western US each year since 1984, and there is a clear increasing trend. And then the figure on the right hand side showing that not only for Western US, but for Midwest and Eastern US as well, we're seeing more area burned and a larger number of fires. And we know this is not only a problem in the US that we're seeing wildfires increasing across many parts of the world as well. But for the talk today, I will be mostly just focusing on the US. Next slide, please. And then Dr. Liu also mentioned this. So we're mostly looking at wildfire as an important source of air pollution. And we know that they can travel very far in distance and significantly contribute to surface air pollution. And among many of the pollutants, the PM2.5, the fine particulate matter, is the one that received the most attention, and I'll spend most time talking about it today. But in the end, I'll also briefly mention some of our other work looking at other pollutants. So the two figures show are two screenshots on the air quality index, basically on this 2 days, September 2020 and then June 2023. Both were extreme wildfire smoke episodes, one from the wildfire in Northern California and the other from the Quebec wildfire. So both, you can sort of see that they travel long distance and impact dramatically the surface level of air pollution. Next slide, please. So in the remaining time, I'll briefly cover the following topics. So first of all, to understand health impacts, we need exposure data. So how do we assess the population exposure to smoke PM2.5? And using this data set to answer how has wildfire smoke contribute to US PM2.5 change over time, and then looking ahead into the future, what's the projected smoke level and the mortality burden under future climate scenarios. Next slide. So like most our exposure modeling work for air pollution, so there are two main type of approaches we can use to model the outdoor, the ambient smoke PM2.5 concentration. One is what we call the bottom-up approach. This is combined chemical transport model with a wildfire emissions inventory, and we simulate two runs of simulations, one with wildfires and one without wildfires, and we take the differences as as the estimates for wildfire smoke PM. So there has been a lot of important work done in this realm. One thing that's specific challenging about wildfire smoke is that there are particular uncertainty in the wildfire emission inventory and other chemical and physical parameters such as injection height of wildfire smoke. And that makes it particularly challenging to model wildfire smoke contributions to surface PM. On the other hand, so on the bottom of the slides there is the data-driven technique. So we can combine satellite data, surface observations with the machine learning techniques to do this data-driven approach to directly estimate the level of wildfire smoke contribution to PM 2.5 in the atmosphere. So we have been developing some of this data, and then like most of my remaining talk will be talking about the kind of work using this exposure data. But I just want to also highlight there are different ways of modeling exposure right now, and it remains an important scientific question to sort of compare them with each other and to understand the implications for health impacts from different exposure data sets. Next slide. So this is work led by my colleague Marissa Childs, who's assistant professor at University of Washington right now. So using this data-driven technique I was talking about, we're able to develop this data set. This is daily at 10-kilometer spatial resolution, specifically estimating the wildfire smoke contribution to PM 2.5. And the latest version of the data is from 2006 to 2024. This data set is publicly available to use. And from this figure, you can see that there is a very clear increasing trend in the wildfire smoke PM 2.5 in the US. And specifically, really for the past few years, wildfire smoke PM 2.5 has really been like their contribution to our PM 2.5 is so high. And it's also very clearly demonstrated that this is not just a problem in the Western US, but also across the whole United States due to the long range transport. Next slide. Specifically using the data set that Marissa developed, we're able to see that the past 5 years, so from 2020 to 2024, those has been the worst five smoke years in the last 20 years. So here, this figure shows for average person in the US, the cumulative exposure they have for wildfire smoke PM 2.5. And you have seen a similar figure for, or similar statement on other like climate change related phenomena, temperature, heat, but for smoke is really the same story, that we're living in this sort of new crisis mode that the past 5 years has been really the worst in the near recent history. Next slide. And if we take one step back, so this slide, this is a paper led by Marshall Burke, Stanford, and so this figure shows just the overall trend in PM 2.5 measured across US. And this is not just wildfire smoke, but including all other sources as well. So what we see here is from early 2000 to 2015, there has been a steady decline in PM 2.5 concentrations thanks to Clean Air Act and the clean energy transition. But around 2015-ish, this progress has been stagnated or reversed. And the next slide, please. And through the data set I was talking about earlier, we're able to show that this stagnation and reversal is really because of the contribution due to wildfire smoke. So here, the blue line shows the trend in non-smoke PM 2.5, and you can see in most of the country, this declining trend continues, and it's really because of the smoke contribution, which is this gray wedge here, that the PM 2.5 has really increased in many parts of the country. So wildfire smoke is really instrumental in the stagnation and the reversal of PM 2.5 trend in the US. Next slide. So the reason for increasing wildfire smoke is multiple-fold, but one of the most important one is climate change. So because of climate change, we're having hotter weather and drier weather, and essentially we have better conditions for wildfire to happen and to spread. So in this work that we built this 3-stage model framework to understand how wildfire smoke pollution and mortality burden evolve under climate scenario. In the first stage, we build an ensemble of statistical and machine learning models link climate and land use variables to wildfire emissions. In the second stage, we'll link wildfire emissions to wildfire smoke PM2.5 concentration. And in the third stage, we link wildfire smoke PM2.5 to mortality data, so to have this smoke-specific epidemiological evidence on how wildfire smoke specifically affects our human health. Next slide. So when we put this model together, this figure shows our projections for wildfire smoke level. So the upper left shows the historical wildfire smoke PM2.5 levels, and then the other 3 figures show our projections under climate scenario in 2050 across the 3 warming scenarios. Next one. And then if we calculate the population exposure to wildfire smoke, we project that in 2050, the level is about 2 to 3 times higher than what we are witnessing already today. Next slide. Then one of the challenge, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will talk a little bit about this, is the emerging of the epidemiological evidence on wildfire smoke PM. So as part of this work, we also developed this long-term exposure response function of smoke PM 2.5 to mortality in the US population. What we find is there is a significant increase in all-cause mortality rates under high level of smoke exposure. And also, interestingly, there is this lagged effect that the population are exposed to smoke this year, where we not only see a mortality increase in this year, but also in the following years after the smoke exposure as well. Next slide. And then just putting everything together, we estimate that the wildfire smoke PM 2.5 will lead to about 70,000 annual premature deaths in the 2050s in the US, and this is about 30,000 more relative to what we are seeing today. One really important finding we find here is really across the 3 warming scenarios, we're seeing similar level of wildfire smoke, and that is simply because of the inertia of the climate system, right? So even if we are able to reduce our carbon emissions today, we are going to see quite some warming and a lot of smoke in the near future. So that really demonstrates the importance of adaptation measures. Next slide. One of the motivations for studying wildfire smoke under future climate is because if we look at some of the leading climate impact assessment, including some of those developed by US EPA, wildfire smoke, although it's widely recognized as an important part of climate channel, it has not been formally incorporated into the climate impact assessment work. So one of the ways is the policymakers calculate the metric called social cost of carbon, which is calculating the monetary damage per additional ton of CO2. So in the follow-up work, we calculate the social cost of carbon from wildfire smoke mortality in the US and use this as a way to compare with other climate damages. Next slide. So I think I'll skip this one in the interest of time. So we calculate that if we emit a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, the additional CO2 leads to additional warming and the additional smoke pollution and smoke mortality. And if we monetize this by calculating the net present value, this is about $11 per ton CO2 emitted just from US wildfire smoke damage. And next slide. And if we compare this to other channels that are already included in some of this integrated assessment models, we find that smoke is really an important damage sector that was overlooked in the previous analysis. And by including smoke, the US social cost of carbon will almost double compared to the original ones that we didn't include that. So that again really emphasizes that wildfire smoke is an important climate impact in the US. And finally, this is my final slide. So far, I have been only talking about PM 2.5, but we know that the community recognizes that wildfire smoke emits a huge variety of complex chemical species. And so, for instance, Dr. Yang Liu's group has been working on this from the PM speciation perspective. This is one of our latest work looking at wildfire smoke ozone, which is, again, another important air pollution cursor, and wildfire smoke has an important contribution to it. One of the really interesting findings we find is they don't really correlate with each other, wildfire smoke ozone and wildfire smoke PM. So much of the smoke ozone exposure come from low to medium smoke PM 2.5 days. So that, again, really emphasize the importance of having a multi-pollutant perspective in assessing the wildfire smoke exposure and its health impacts. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion and questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dr. Chiu. Let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Margaret Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a principal research scientist at Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Before joining Harvard, Dr. Johnson was the director of air pollution and health research at the Sean Parker Center for Asthma Allergy Research at Stanford. She leads studies which investigate the impact of air pollution and wildfires on immune health in the context of climate change. Dr. Johnson, go ahead. You're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. What I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is just give you a brief introduction to the LA fire health studies. I'm just going to touch on some of the findings and just give you an overview of how it's organized. And hopefully you'll find it interesting. So the LA Fire Health Study kind of stemmed from obviously the fires that occurred in LA in January, and many academic institutions came together. This is a partial list right on the screen. But many institutions came together knowing that if we can pool the knowledge, pool the resources, the community will be better served. And so that, let's see, and you're going to advance the slides. Sorry. Okay, thank you. So that has resulted in a large team of scientists. Some of the scientists, as you can see listed here, focus more on the environmental exposure side. And I believe, Joe Allen was the one that's going to talk more today on exposure side. If you go to the next slide, I am involved more on the health impacts side. And so there's many studies going on, large groups of people, and everybody kind of has their own area of expertise. And so it's a really wonderful way to learn more about the health impacts from wildfire smoke exposure and also help the community. Next slide, please. So this is just a smattering of some of the cohorts that the different institutions are working with. For example, I am most involved in something called the 50 Home Study. The 50 Home Study is led by Joe Allen. The health part of it is led by Kari Nadeau, who is my director, and then I am involved on the health side of it. And I'll be talking in a little bit about that particular study. But as you can see, there's many cohorts, all with slightly different focuses. And so some of the cohorts are quite large. And so, this is a fantastic opportunity to learn more about smoke exposure and impacts on health. Next slide, please. And what they've been doing since this consortium was created is try to inform the public, the community, those in LA impacted most by the fires as they discover new results, and put a data brief together for them, and also, for to educate, policy and everything else, but to put something together, even if it's only, one aspect of a study, if it's novel or is going to have a potentially significant impact on their health. So these are just some of the examples, and I'm going to go through just a few of them in the next couple minutes. Next slide, please. So one of the goals was to try to determine how many people were actually impacted by the fires that went on in January in the LA regions. The estimate is over 19 million over the course of 10 days of the fire. So that's a tremendous, obviously, amount of people. And, you know, the focus is obviously on those in the immediate area of LA. But as we all know, the smoke exposure, you know, because of the smoke traveled, did involve other populations. Next slide, please. And some of the really interesting data that's coming out of these studies, which I'm sure Joanne was going to talk about in more detail, was the focus on indoor air quality. And so if you look at these bar graphs, you can see the red are actually levels of indoor concentrations, whereas the gray is outdoor. And it's remarkable to see, you know, this select group of toxicants actually elevated in the indoor air versus the outdoor. So in general, this is going to be a very brief overview of the short and long-term health impacts of wildfire smoke. It's something we could talk about for, you know, hours at length for the studies that have come out in the past few years. But this slide depicts with what certainty what the literature says for different types of organ systems. The first being respiratory impacts. We know that, and the dark bar is the confidence level. And so the most studies, the longest studies have been done on respiratory health impacts from the smoke. Without a doubt, there are increases in asthma exacerbations. We see increases in emergency ER visits for asthma exacerbations, hospital admissions for asthma exacerbations, increases in things like COPD exacerbations, pneumonia, acute bronchitis. The next level of confidence is in the mental health realm, which there have been more studies recently focusing on mental health. And the data shows that there are increases in anxiety and depression in populations when they're exposed to exposed to the smoke. When you look at pregnancy and birth outcomes, there's a solid amount of data showing that, you know, there are negative impacts for both pregnancy and birth outcomes. For example, depending on where a mother is, what trimester and how much smoke she's exposed to, she may have an increased risk of having the baby early, or the baby being of low birth weight. And, you know, those things like having a premature baby can have lifelong impacts for that child, including studies that have shown that a baby born premature, even as an adult, will have more health impacts from being exposed to wildfire smoke. Cardiovascular risk, there is a fair amount of studies showing that there are increases in things like heart attacks, arrhythmias, also something called sudden cardiac death, which is when the heart just literally stops and the person, you know, collapses. And there have been studies showing that exposure to wildfire smoke does increase these incidents, especially in those older populations, 60 and older, in particular, one study showed. And then, there's other studies that are coming out showing that, for example, if a population is exposed to smoke, they're going to have increases in things like eczema, itching, um, uh, cancer. There's a study that came out in Canada showing association with cancer and communities exposed to wildfire smoke. And so we're learning more and more. And then, of course, there's the health outcomes from being directly exposed to the flames. But these other health outcomes, have not been appreciated until more recently with the increase in wildfires, especially in the West. Next slide, please. So one of the things that, one of the research areas that has come out with the LA health group is that they found that both lead and mercury levels are higher in the firefighters who fought these fires in LA in January as compared to firefighters who were fighting forest fires. I believe the levels of lead were 5 times higher and mercury about 3 times higher than their counterparts that were only, fighting forest fires. And, one of the reasons is obviously when the fires went through the LA region, everything that are in the home is also being combusted and becoming part of the smoke and being inhaled by the firefighters. And so this is an important um, uh, finding to follow up on with the firefighters. Both lead and mercury obviously are very toxic, and hopefully these firefighters are going to be followed long term. I believe they are. So we can learn more about long-term impacts from the smoke exposure. Next slide, please. So some groups have focused more on the outdoor air quality, as the previous speaker was just talking about. Particulate matter is often followed with fires. And this is just showing you how the two regions, the Altadena and the Palisades regions, how the level of PM10 varied, even from, I believe one is morning and one is later in the day. And it's a nice illustration of how it's very dependent on your location to the fire and time of day in terms of exposure. And then the really wonderful thing about some of these collaborations is that they're looking for the first time more detail at indoor air quality during the fires. And they were able to look at over 1,000 homes and show in what regions the indoor air quality concentrations, were impacted. I don't have a separate map, and I don't know if they've overlaid which homes are actually evacuated during that time, but certainly indoor air quality has not been as appreciated or been able to be assessed during some of these large, mega fires that have happened in the past. And this is specifically looking at VOCs and the indoor air quality. And the red and the blue are the locations of the smoke. And then the yellow bars show the indoor levels of VOCs, and the blue bar is the outdoor. And what I found interesting looking at this image is that, again, the indoor VOCs are much higher than the outdoor VOCs at a lot of these monitoring sites. And then There was recently a publication looking at the level of chromium-6 or hexavalent chromium during the fires. And what they found that it was actually elevated in the air, in particular near some of the cleanup sites of the fires. There's a paper by, excuse me, a paper by Michael Jarrett, who spearheaded this. And they found that most of the chromium-6 was in the form of nanoparticles, so less than 56 nanometers in these cleanup zones. And the reason that the size is so important because at 56 nanometers, the chromium is small enough to go into the cells of our body, and also small enough and light enough to be transported in the air. And they found that some of the transport occurred up to 6 miles from the actual fire affected regions. And so, yeah, next slide. That was, one of the findings that they, informed the public and worked with the public health department and with other officials to try to educate the public and provide also, as you can see on this slide, some guidance for what the public can do to try to reduce their exposure after returning to their home post evacuation. And some of the recommendations included, filtering of indoor air with air purifiers, hopefully HEPA, with using HEPA filters, controlling the house dust, trying to minimize what's brought in from outside. So, for example, taking off shoes, wiping your animals, your dogs and cats' paws if they're outside, things like that. And then monitoring their indoor and potentially outdoor air quality because, we know that the soot obviously is a huge undertaking to try to completely clean up after the fire. And then, of course, the use of N95 or even P100 mask when appropriate. Next slide. And so I'm just going to talk briefly about the 50 home study. It is a study led by Joe Allen, and they looked at both the Palisades and the Altadena area, and they were able to get very good indoor and outdoor measurements of air quality when the people returned. These are all evacuees who came back to their home. And they've also done a lot of sampling of the soil, of their water, of their house dust um, uh, in a longitudinal fashion. And then our piece of it, our lab, has been collecting biomarkers from the participants in the home. And our goal is to look at the relationship between, what is going on in the blood and, in the immune system and what the evacuees are actually being exposed to in their homes. One area that we're interested in is the microplastic levels that the people, the evacuees are being exposed to. We know that there's a lot of plastics that weren't combusted during the fire. They are present in the soot. And so we're involved with trying to measure the level of microplastics in the blood and also look at it over time. There's emerging studies showing that exposure to microplastics does have detrimental health impacts. There's a lot of research to be done, but there's been studies showing that there are increases in concentration of microplastics in people who have carotid endarterectomies in their plaque, and that's associated with both cardiac long-term outcomes in addition to mortality, even years later. And so there's other areas that we're realizing microplastics, is having a detrimental impact on our health. Fertility is another one, dementia. There's been associations with microplastics in the brain and dementia. And so more and more studies are showing these associations. Next slide. And so we were able to collect tiny amounts of blood from the participants, and we'll be looking at microplastic levels, toxic metals in their blood, other chemicals such as forever chemicals. We're an immunology lab. We'll be looking at immune functioning, changes in the regulation of the DNA. We know from air pollution studies that when someone is exposed to pollution, there will be epigenetic modifications of their DNA and, will impact the functioning of their immune system, and then overall clinical health impacts. And this is just a picture of a GCMS machine, a mass spec machine that can measure chemicals in the blood. Next slide. And then also we have the ability to measure proteins in the blood at very small concentrations. And we've been analyzing people's blood actually prior to the fire versus post-fire. And then also people who return to their home and monitoring their immune function over time. And so all of this research of the consortium is committed to engaging with the community, to involving the community as much as possible. They hold webinars and town halls. They produce the flyers that I provided some examples of. And then the next slide, they also work closely with local, state, and federal government officials in trying to provide the best science information possible in a timely fashion. If you would like to learn more about the LA Fire Consortium, or in particular the health impacts division of it, this is the website. Anyhow, it's a very novel, large scale. Yeah, this is an extra slide. Very wonderful collaboration. So yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions when the time comes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mary. Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Stowell. Dr. Stowell is an assistant professor of global environmental and occupational health at the University of Maryland School of Public Health. She's an environmental epidemiologist, and her current research focuses on the health impacts of extreme heat, wildland fire smoke, with special attention to vulnerable populations such as pregnant women, children, and older adults. Jen, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Yang, for that kind introduction. And also, again, thank you to CAFE and the groups at both BU and Harvard for the invitation to take part on this panel. So I'm pleased to be here to talk about how we can actually inform fuel management policies through health studies related to prescribed fire smoke exposure. Next slide. As we have heard in the past couple of presentations, the last few decades have been marked by significant increases in wildfire activity, with longer wildfire seasons, more frequent and intense wildfire events. There are, however, very limited options when it comes to either adaptation or mitigation of wildfire activity. Prescribed burning is a practice that is used in some parts of the world for fuel management. And this includes controlled burns that are done by permit generally and under specific environmental conditions. So periods of low heat, low winds, and higher humidity days. So here in the graph on the right, we're looking at the increased use of prescribed burning in both the number of fires as well as the acreage from 2003 to 2018. And as you can see, there's been a fairly precipitous increase in burning since about 2015. Next slide. In these maps, we see that the dominant types of fires has a fairly regional pattern in the US. So in the top map, we can see that the majority of wildfire area burned tends to be located in the west and the southwest. And then in the map on the bottom, we're looking at the spatial distribution of prescribed burning. So there's actually 41 states that participate in some form of prescribed burning on some level. However, the majority of this burning, approximately 70%, occurs in the southeastern US. So in 2020 alone, this amounted to over 1 million acres that were burned across the region. And smoke from prescribed fires actually contributes more than 20% of the total PM 2.5 levels in these southeastern states. Next slide. So recent evidence has shown the efficacy of prescribed burning at lowering both the burn severity and the amount of PM 2.5 emissions from wildfires. This figure is from a recent study by Makoto Kelp that estimates changes in California wildfire burn severity and PM 2.5 emissions by fuel management strategies in the Western US. So by treatment type, by land cover that's burned, and then whether the treatment area was in the wild and urban interface or out. So there's a lot going on in this figure. We're just going to focus where this box is in this first column, where it's comparing prescribed burning to mechanical thinning or physical removal of fuel sources. And as you can see, prescribed fire is actually fairly effective at reducing wildfire burn severity by over 25%, and then also a sizable amount of reduction in PM 2.5 emissions. Next slide. In addition to a reduction in fire severity and pollutant emissions, prescribed fire may actually have an economic co-benefit when we consider the amount of money that is currently spent on active fire suppression or attempts to contain a wildfire that's already burning. Unfortunately, there are more federal dollars available for fire suppression compared to that's available for prescribed burning. And the amount of money for prescribed burns has actually declined over the past several years. So this is especially concerning given that wildfire activity has largely increased over the same period of time, which could in part be a result of less money available to conduct some of these fuel controlling fires. Next slide. So despite its widespread use in the Southeast, the health impacts of prescribed fire are significantly understudied compared to wildfire. While prescribed fire may be an effective practice for reducing fuel loads, they could be problematic as far as health is concerned because there are instances where we are knowingly adding pollutants into the air, and these often occur in much closer proximity to populated areas. So as mentioned just a second ago, there's a paucity of research on the health responses that are related to the exposures. So of the studies in existence, the majority of these are what we call health impact assessments. And these are assessments that estimate the impact by using already published information. And the majority of these are done, well, actually all of these are done using either total PM 2.5 or wildfire specific, what we call concentration response functions. So this is a measure of the impact of exposure. And this represents complications because the composition of prescribed fires has been shown to vary substantially from wildfire smoke pollutants, and that could potentially impact the toxicity of the smoke produced by these fires. So using concentration response functions that are not prescribed fire specific could be either overestimating or underestimating the impact of these fires. Next slide. So for example, a study that was published in 2019 estimated a change in various health outcomes related to prescribed fire smoke exposures. They used various previous effect measures or those concentration response functions that are available in the EPA's BEDMAP system. However, there are no prescribed fire specific functions built into the BEDMAP system. So these estimates reflect calculated impacts largely using total PM 2.5 functions. And then they did bring in one wildfire specific function in the Delfino paper that you can see in a couple of places here. But again, not prescribed fire specific. So in order for us to consider prescribed fire as a tool that should be widely used, we really need to get at these estimates that rely specifically on functions derived from prescribed fire specific epidemiological studies. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of our recent work that has been funded by the Health Effects Institute. looking at the getting at the potential impact of both PM2.5 and ozone from these prescribed fires. And so the population that we're looking at is people who are insured through United Healthcare or Medicare Advantage in 11 southeastern states from 2013 to 2021. We're looking at county level prescribed fire specific PM2.5 and ozone, and specifically looking at emergency department visits for non-external causes or non-accidental causes, and for both respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. And then we were also able to do some subgroup stratification. We did multiple measures of social vulnerability in addition to age and sex, but we'll only be looking at a portion of these today. Next slide. So we utilized what's called a case crossover epidemiologic study design. I think most of us are probably familiar with this, but in case you aren't, it's similar to a case control design. And within this framework, cases are matched to themselves on non-case days as controls. So this is done by matching on the same calendar year, the same calendar month, and the same day of the week. So as we can see in this figure here, if I were to attend an ED visit on the 8th of a specific month, that would be considered my case day. And then I would be matched to myself or my exposures on each of the other days within that same month as a control. Next slide. Our models were run using conditional Poisson regression and a distributed lag nonlinear framework, and we looked at exposure lags of up to 3 days. And all models adjusted for non-smoke PM2.5, non-smoke ozone, temperature, relative humidity, and also for potential behavioral differences on US holidays. We also report our PM2.5 results as risk ratios comparing the 95th percentile of exposure to no exposure. And then we are reporting our ozone results as linear results of risk ratios per 10 ppb increase in ozone. And then we also compared these results by looking at a specific source. So we look at total overall PM2.5 and ozone. And then we also compare non-fire as well as the prescribed fire. And then again, as mentioned previously, we ran our models for multiple different subgroups of interests. Next slide. So these maps show the distribution of emergency department visits and exposure across our study domain. So in panel A, we can see the county level rates of ED visits per 1,000 persons. In panel B, we're looking at the mean daily prescribed fire PM2.5. And in panel C, we're looking at the distribution of mean daily prescribed fire ozone. And these are both on a 12-kilometer grid. And when you compare the two, both B and C, we can see that there's some general overlap in the areas with the highest exposure that tends to be here, kind of on the border between Georgia and Alabama and Florida. And that there's also overlap with some of the highest rates of ED visits in those same areas. Next slide. So here in the top panel, we see the main results from our analyses. Again, we were comparing the 95th percentile of exposure to zero exposure. And when we did that, we observed a 6% increased relative risk of ED visits for ischemic heart disease. And then we saw a 4% increase relative risk for upper respiratory infection, and then a 1% increase for overall for all non-external causes. And then in panel B, we're looking at the exposure response curves for each of the main categories of disease. And those orange lights are representing the 95th percentile of exposure. So when comparing to total and non-fire PM2.5, the results for prescribed fire PM2.5 were actually relatively consistent across the board. None of the results were statistically significantly different for the outcomes of interest. However, a couple of interesting results here for asthma and for COPD were actually surprisingly lower than for the other sources with prescribed fire. And while these results, again, were not statistically significant, it hints at potentially more research needing to be done to identify whether prescribed fire smoke is truly related to a lower relative risk for these outcomes. And this is especially applicable because these are two of the outcomes that tend to have the highest risk related to wildfire PM2.5. Next slide. When modeling the health impacts for ozone, we also saw some significant increased relative risk by some specific health endpoints. We saw a 10% increase in stroke, a 6% for overall cardiovascular diseases, and then a 3% for non-external causes related to, again, that 10 ppb increase in prescribed fire smoke specific ozone. Next slide. When comparing these results, similar to what we did for PM2.5, we actually saw a couple of interesting results. We saw statistically significant differences for ED visits for those non-external causes and also for overall cardiovascular disease. However, unlike smoke-related PM2.5, whose composition can vary depending on what is being burned, ozone doesn't vary. And so hence it's more likely that what we're seeing here is because ozone is acting as a proxy or a tracer for something else potentially in the smoke that results in these differences. Next slide. Unlike many previous studies evaluating wildfire smoke, we actually saw relatively little difference between age groups for either PM2.5 or next slide for the ozone. Not a lot to talk about here. And next slide again. We're looking at stratifying on sex, and we did see some differential effects with looking at increased relative risk of dysrhythmia in females and then for stroke in males. Next slide. And then when doing the same for ozone, we continue to see that differential effect for stroke in males. Next slide. When we stratified our PM2.5 models on the percent of the population with the highest, when we looked at the groups with the highest non-white populations, we saw a significant increase in non-external causes and also for upper respiratory infections. Next slide. For those same models looking at ozone, we saw an increased risk of non-external causes, and then also for overall cardiovascular disease, again, with the highest risk in populations with those larger minority populations. Next slide. Okay, so based on those results, we noted multiple instances of some increased risk for certain health points for both PM2.5 and for ozone. And we showed that for PM2.5, from these burns, the risk varied very little from ambient and non-smoke sources. However, we did see some significant differences for ozone, but again, in this instance, we're assuming the ozone is likely serving as a proxy for some other agent, and more research is needed here. Next slide. So overall, we observed very little differences by subgroups of the population, but again, we did see some significant increases in areas with higher minority populations. Generally, the health effects related to wildfire smoke that have been previously published tend to be higher than what we observed in our study. However, and again, while this could point to lower health effects overall related to prescribed fire, more research is needed to actually directly compare these two smoke sources, and this needs to be done using the same base modeling approach in order to be confident in our comparison. Next slide. So if these results prove to be consistent in additional work, and if the results are indeed lower for prescribed fire when we're appropriately comparing them to those from wildfire, this could prove very informative for changes in prescribed fire policy moving forward. Some of our next steps include estimating these health effects in additional populations. So again, we were looking at an insured population, so looking at uninsured populations, and others will be really important. Also conducting those direct wildfire to prescribed fire comparisons, and then investigating the impacts of exposure to on other health endpoints. And some of the ones that I'm specifically interested in looking at are those related to pregnancy and birth outcomes. So just a quick thank you to to ATI for funding this project, and again, also for the team at Boston University, as well as the team at Georgia Tech that contributed to this research. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions later on in the panel.
Thanks a lot, Jen. Now, Sarah, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Excellent.
Okay, our last speaker is Dr. Sarah Henderson. Dr. Henderson is a professor at the UBC School of Population and Public Health. She's the scientific director of environmental health services at the BC Center for Disease Control and the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health, and oversees a large program of applied research, surveillance, knowledge translation, and training to support evidence-based environmental public health policy and practice in British Columbia and across Canada. She has studied wildfire smoke, its health effects, and effective interventions for over 20 years. Dr. Henderson, go ahead.
Great. Thank you for that nice introduction, Yang. So for those of you who don't know me, I am primarily the scientific director of environmental health at the BC Center for Disease Control, which is our provincial public health agency. So I'm a public servant and a public health practitioner who is also a researcher and leads and oversees a research program kind of embedded in the core public health needs of the province of British Columbia. And I often refer to wildfire smoke as the new pollution. We have been talking for decades about the health harms associated with air pollution from other sources, and we're now in this world where this is becoming a dominant exposure in many people's lives. That's not universally true, but certainly in North America, we are seeing that shift. Next slide, please. I am speaking to you today from the town of Yellowknife, which is in Northwest Territories in Canada. It's located on the Chief Dry Grease Territory in the traditional homelands of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. I do not usually present from here, but I'm here for some meetings over the next couple of days. Most of the work that we do is conducted on the traditional and never ceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in what we now know as Vancouver, British Columbia. Next slide, please. The BC Centre for Disease Control is a program of the Provincial Health Services Authority in BC, and our agency has been gifted 6 teachings by a Coast Salish knowledge keeper to help guide our work. The teachings are in the Hulkamalum language, and of these teachings, I often like to highlight Nutsamat when I am speaking about climate change. This means we are one. And I like to speak about it as a reminder of the fact that the health of humans, other animals, and the land are interconnected in ways that we often don't discuss when we're talking about environmental epidemiology. But if we step back and think of the Earth as a closed system where humans are integrated into everything in that system and not sitting at the top of the pyramid of that system, it can help to reframe and really highlight some of these changes that are happening for all of us. Next slide, please. These are data from across Canada showing PM2.5 sources over time over the past 30 years or so. The pink bars are dust and fires. The gray is home firewood burning, which is still commonly practiced in many parts of Canada, including Yellowknife. Gray is other sources, and then blue is the agricultural sector. And what you can see if you look back to 1990 is that the purple bars are a relatively small proportion of the total PM2.5 emissions. And then when you track that over time, they are becoming a larger and larger and larger slice of the pie. So overall emissions have gone down, but the contribution from dust and fires, and really this is mostly fires, is growing and growing. So while we're bringing these other source of emissions under control through regulation, we are seeing this shift in the overall emissions profiles and resulting exposures to the Canadian population. And this is going to be very similar in the US as well. Next slide, please. Now, the 2023 wildfire season in Canada has received a great deal of attention. And for those of you who haven't followed this closely, I want you to see how this looked compared with the decades that came before it. And the takeaway message was that it was a record-setting wildfire season in each of the 3 major regions of wildfire in Canada, in the West, in the East, and in the North. So often we have a bad season in one region and the other seasons are okay. We had the worst season ever in all 3 of these regions. And what's happening here is that we have decades of historic forest management practice where we excluded wildfire from a naturally flammable landscape, now colliding with hotter, windier, drier weather and leading to larger fires. So this isn't only a climate change impact, but those decades of the way we've done things previously is starting to intersect with those climatic changes. And as a result, in Canada, as in the US and elsewhere throughout the world, we are starting to discuss the use of prescribed fire more aggressively, managing the wildfire risk and reintroducing fire into our naturally flammable landscape. Our premier fire scientists in Canada recently published this opinion saying that we are spreading into uncharted territory in Canada at this time. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at those fire seasons and we translate them into total carbon emissions, we can see the previous kind of 20 years down in the gray lines on the bottom, with the mean trend as the darkest of those gray lines. The 2023 wildfire season is the top red dashed line. You can clearly see how different it was from the seasons that preceded it, and you can see how consistent those emissions were right throughout the season. The bottom dashed line is the 2024 wildfire season, and you can see that even that following season was something quite different from the decades that came before. And then the solid red line is the data as complete as I have them through the 2025 season, and it's going to end up somewhere in the middle. So in the past 3 years in Canada, we have had the 3 worst wildfire smoke seasons on record. Next slide, please. Thanks to Stephanie Cleland for putting together this image that clearly highlights why wildfire smoke is so different from those other sources of air pollution that we've been concerned about over the past 70 years. And if you look at what's going on during these wildfire periods in yellow, and you look at what's going on during these background periods, there's a few things we need to consider here. So first of all, these are temporally variable. We don't know when there are going to be significant wildfire impacts. Even if we know they're going to happen in a season, we don't know when during that season they might occur. And we really have no good way to predict this, more than maybe a week in advance at this point. They are spatially episodic and unpredictable, so we don't really know where fires are going to happen. We know they are going to happen, but pinpointing those locations is challenging. The magnitude of these exposures is far higher than we would see from any other source. Even on, a muggy, hot, stagnant day where we have no mixing in Vancouver, for example, we are not going to see PM 2.5 concentrations higher than maybe 30 micrograms per meter cubed over 24-hour average. That's the most I can imagine. But we can easily get up to 100, 200 micrograms per meter cubed during these wildfire seasons. And we've seen concentrations, on an hourly basis that go off the charts of what our instruments are capable of measuring. The composition is also highly variable. What comes out of your vehicle comes out of your vehicle pretty consistently. It's pretty much always the same stuff, and that's true for industrial facilities as well. They emit a pretty constant kind of pollution in the same places all the times, in roads or at a location. But the composition of wildfire smoke is highly dynamic and dependent on multiple different variables, including how far that smoke has traveled. And then the most important difference in these types of pollution is we cannot regulate this at source. It's just not an option. We can do things to try to reduce wildfire risk over time so that these exposures are lower for populations, but we don't have full control here. Next slide, please. We have been working on, with Stephanie, this idea of methods to look at long-term wildfire smoke exposure. We know that when it's smoky outside, there are a wide range of impact on the health of the exposed populations. When we look at new outcomes, we generally see associations with these new outcomes. So I think we can extrapolate based on what we know about air pollution from other sources and say wildfire smoke affects pretty much every organ system in the body and is going to have a wide range of acute effects. We really now need to turn our attention to those longer lasting health impacts, and we need the right tools to assess exposure for those longer lasting health impacts. We need tools that account for the episodic nature of the exposure, the magnitude of the exposure, and the duration of the exposure over multi-year periods. So we have been working on these methods that we're calling multi-wise that help us separate wildfire smoke from non-wildfire smoke over time, and then add ways to measure, how episodic it was, how big the exposures were. And you can see here we've got multi-wise methods applied to a not very smoke impacted location in BC. And there's a very small cumulative smoke impact over this 13-year period. When we choose a much more smoke impacted location, we can see the total PM 2.5 exposure, the non-wildfire smoke PM 2.5 exposure, and then a significant wildfire smoke exposure accumulated over this period. Next slide, please. This is really just to highlight what Yang said, and Minghao as well originally, is like, these are not just local events anymore. This is a global and continental concern. And, this is a smoky day in North America in, I think this was 2023 wildfire season as well. And I'm not sure. And in some ways it doesn't matter because we see this over and over and over again. The entire continent blanketed in smoke from fires that are happening in a wide range of locations. And this, places where this smoke is really dense, places where it's not dense, and just the dynamic nature of what's going on day by day and year over year. Next slide, please. And then, going back to Jen's talk and the talk before, increasingly, we're not just talking about smoke from wildland fuels. We have anthropogenic fuels burning either at the interface or as part of urban conflagration that has been kickstarted by landscape fire. And so it's another complexity being added on to something that's already quite complex. We just have to assume that the smoke from these synthetic fuels is far more toxic than the smoke from the landscape fuels, and those are already plenty toxic. Next slide, please. So we did a journal club on this article in my group earlier this week, and it really highlights the intercontinental nature of this problem. So an excellent modeling exercise by Minghao's group to really break down where smoke originated, where it went, and what the health impacts of its travel was for smoke from those 2023 wildfires. The key messages are that smoke went everywhere and likely had widespread health impacts, not only in Canada and the US, but on a more intercontinental scale. And I don't think we can put, absolute confidence in the numbers here. There were several sensitivity analyses to show that the exposure response relationship matters, or the functions matter in terms of the numbers that are estimated. What we can say is there were likely thousands of deaths associated with this air pollution that originated in Canada, and they happened worldwide. Next slide, please. And this is really this is from Minghao's paper, and this is the last two sentences of the abstract. And I've been talking about it every time I talk about smoke pretty much since the paper came out. When monetized, climate-driven smoke deaths result in economic damages that exceed existing estimates of climate-driven damages from all other causes combined in the US. Our research suggests that the health impacts of climate-driven wildfire smoke could be among the most important and costly consequences of a warming climate in the US. That's going to be true for Canada as well. And it serves to frame the importance of this question. So I've been studying wildfire smoke for 20 years and trying to say, this is going to be huge. This is going to be huge. And now it's getting huge. And we're really at that stage of, okay, we need more evidence on the health effects. That's clear. But we have enough evidence to say, this is huge, and it's not going to stop happening. The fires aren't going to stop next year. So we need to start thinking as a society how we are protecting folks from the risks associated with these exposures. Next slide, please. And those risks are variable depending on when they're occurring in the life course. So there's already been some talk about early life exposures during pregnancy, neonatal, infancy, and childhood. Those intersections of extreme exposures and rapid growth and development have the potential to have lifelong impacts for those who are exposed. As people get older and they're, moving into adulthood, they're outside more, they're doing harder work, there's different types of exposures and different susceptibilities. And then as we move into older age, there's natural degradation of lung function and cardiovascular function and higher susceptibility due to those things and more presence of chronic disease. So we really have to be thinking about when in their lives people are being exposed. Next slide, please. These are unpublished data from my PhD student, Emma Branch. We have a cohort of infants who were in utero during the 2016 and 2019 wildfire seasons and the 2017 and 2018 wildfire seasons. And I split them out that way because 2016 and 2019 were very below average seasons in British Columbia, and 2017 and 2018 were extreme seasons in the province. So we have good exposure contrast among these infants. And we are looking at 4 different birth outcomes here: stillbirth, extreme preterm birth, so right on the edge of viability, very preterm birth, and moderate to late preterm birth. And we can see across all 4 years that there is an impact of smoke for each of these outcomes. And then when we separate the extreme seasons in green from the below average seasons in yellow, we see this huge difference. So we feel quite confident that these exposures in utero are having significant, when we're talking about extreme preterm birth, that's a very expensive outcome if if that infant is viable. And obviously stillbirth is not someone anybody wants to experience. We also have evidence that there's probably significant early pregnancy loss too, but it's a challenging thing to measure. Next slide, please. These are data from the same cohort, but looking at the health of live births in the first year of life compared with their preterm exposures, and risk in this case of otitis media and antibiotic treated otitis media. So, if you get antibiotics in your first year of life, we know that there's health impacts associated with that intervention. And what we see is almost all otitis media is antibiotic treated, and that there is increased risk of having an antibiotic treated infection in the first year of life for exposure during every stage of pregnancy, but the difference is much bigger for that second trimester, middle pregnancy period. Next slide, please. These are data from Joan Casey's group, and just highlighting that there seems to be a profound difference in risk of dementia associated with wildfire PM 2.5 compared with non-wildfire PM 2.5. And these are exposures over 3 years prior to becoming an incident case. That's actually not a long runway when we're talking about chronic disease. And if you look at the estimates for the under 75 age category here in those kind of younger seniors, that is a huge odds ratio in environmental epidemiology. Just gigantic. So some clear evidence that, these exposures matter, and they're having a big impact compared with PM 2.5 from other sources. Next slide, please. This is similar data for heart failure from Yang's group. And on the left-hand side, you've got the smoke PM 2.5. The non-smoke PM 2.5. Two plots look kind of similar until you'll realize that they are different by an order of magnitude. On the left-hand side, the PM 2.5 scale ends at 1.5 micrograms per meter cubed. On the right-hand side, it ends around 15. So there's this order of magnitude difference between these two types of PM 2.5. And once again, this was in a 3-year window prior to the incident case. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do about this? We cannot maintain status quo of hoping that people put on an N95 respirator and use an air cleaner in their homes. We need to take this further, and we need to start looking at more top-down approaches. And I've been framing this in the context of the hierarchy of controls because I think it's a helpful way to think about things. Elimination, that is not an option. We're coming to the end of COP30. Lots of talk about the fact that these processes haven't been all that effective to date. Substitution, I jokingly have in here that, Mars is not looking like a promising option for us. So we need to be focusing on those engineering and administrative pieces and aggressively making the indoor environment a safer place to be. 90% of the people spend more than 90% of their times indoors all the time. That's a really good place to start. Look administrative protections for people who have to be outdoors or are, want to be outdoors, thinking about increasing the strength of occupational regulation. We have some states that have done that very well and looking to spread that more broadly. How are we handling outdoor sporting events or big activities or big gatherings? We've got FIFA coming next summer and lots of talk about like how do we manage these types of things, and then acknowledging that PPE is going to continue to have an important role to play, but it's not an equitable way of protecting people. Next slide, please. Indoors, there's no excuse not to be building new buildings that are resilient to this exposure. It needs to be baked into building codes. I think we're moving that way in Canada. The new building code's coming out very soon, and then we're not going to see an update for another 5 years. So it's going to be a 5-year window before we have the opportunity to really ensure that's in there, looking for those policy windows and those levers. Thinking about how to retrofit existing buildings, or at least keep one room in every home as smoke-free as possible. And while these interventions seem incredibly expensive in the short term, when you look at those costs over the long term of these exposures, they will be a bargain for sure. Next slide, please. And then, what are we doing outside? What are the occupational legislations that are going to work? What are the consistent and risk-based approaches to sporting events or other big outdoor events? What education do people need to help them understand how important these exposures are? And then I'll parrot my colleague and mentor, Dr. Michael Brower, who often says, like, maybe we need to rethink when summer is. Maybe summer has to be May and June, and then, kids are in school in July and August, so we can protect them from these exposures, and just shifting, like a paradigm shift of the way that we run society, because we know that these exposures are going to be concentrated during certain periods of the year. Next slide, please. The last thing I want to say before I wrap up is that there may also be significant potential in pharmaceutical and nutritional interventions, and that's not something that people have dug into deeply. But if you think about the biological plausibility, the primary mechanism of harm here is inflammation. Well, what if you take an Advil every morning when it's smoky outside? It's an effective way to fight inflammation. Would that help to protect people from these effects? It's low cost, and it has the potential to have a huge societal impact. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I want to thank all the panelists for their outstanding presentations. Now we move on to sort of the next phase of this panel discussion. I'm up a few questions, and then we open up the forum for kind of a live Q&A session. So I want to kind of generally follow the exposure, health effects, policy, and action in this direction, right? What do you think is going to be the most, high potential new technique or new data that can enhance our ability to monitor fire smoke and conduct exposure assessment? Feel free to chime in.
I'm going to chime in.
Sure.
I don't. I'm not technology, but I was part of the ASHRAE 44 guidance, and pretty clear guidance in there that if you want to be managing indoors exposures, you got to be measuring them, and just starting to integrate indoor air quality monitoring into what is always done in the indoor environment. Like every building is monitoring temperature and humidity let's just add CO2 and PM 2.5 to that suite of stuff that we always know about indoors. I feel like it's time for that, and it's pretty low barrier. I will raise the one concern. Sissy Lou's been part of the maintenance panel for Guideline 44, and that the ultra fine and what she calls the super fine fraction, and the ability of low cost sensors to measure those very fine particles well is certainly a question.
Thanks, Sarah. Jen, Minghao, any thoughts?
I think I'm less familiar with the exposure side of things, but I mean, I think we're already making strides with getting better and better monitoring capabilities with satellite data and things like that. Unfortunately, we don't have monitors that can like readily say, okay, this amount was ambient and this amount was PM 2.5. But from the health side of things, I think one of the most important things we can be doing or one of the biggest opportunities is more digital. We all, I'm sure, have a patient gateway with our primary care clinicians who give us updates on our test results and things like that. And I think there's a lot that can be done there to harness that as a tool, as a communication tool, especially for individuals who might be at higher risk. So you could imagine if I'm a parent of an asthmatic child, I get a warning via my email or on my phone, saying that tomorrow's likely to be a fire day, or there's smoke heading your way. You should, take measures to keep your child indoors, etc. So at least from the health side, that's something that I see that can be a huge benefit both to clinicians and to their patients.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with what Sarah and Jen just talked about. I want to, sort of put a scientific hat on me first and then take it off. I think from a scientific perspective, we see, there has been a lot of interesting discussions on the diverse set of chemical species we are able to observe in those wildfire smoke exposure. Like the LA fire study, they have done a tremendous amount of work measuring different species, and there's always some surprise there, here or there. Like there are the different chemical components that we didn't really think about, that we didn't think it's going to be so high in wildfire smoke, and then linking to health, maybe they have a unique health impacts. So I think to solve that gap, there's just the different disciplines need to come together, right? And then just bring in all the instruments that can measure different chemical, biological samples that come together. But then so when I take my scientific hat off, I think another really interesting, and I think Jen talked a little bit in her talk, is that from a health impacts perspective, especially to a level to inform policy understanding, we don't need to know everything in the wildfire smoke. Sometimes we can just use those things that we can measure really well, and they're sort of our proxy species, right? So they are like the PM 2.5 and ozone and maybe carbon monoxide, things like that. And yeah, sure, they are not the one element that kills you, but they are co-emitted with the thousands of other species. So I do feel like there is another direction to go there, is to really double down our existing efforts on monitoring PM 2.5, PM10, those regular pollutants, right? And this one promising area in that is the citizen science kind of projects, things like Propel Air or low-cost air quality sensors. They can only measure PM 2.5, and some of them claim they can measure VOC. But I still think that's a very useful sort of data set to dig in, because again, that's tremendously increased the kind of coverage capability that we can cover, that we can now monitor more regions, we can more people and more community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I completely agree, Minghao. Like I have the scientist hat as well, and this is such a complex exposure. And like I highlighted these differences in wildfire smoke PM and non-wildfire smoke. We don't know how much of that's actually just being driven by co-pollutants, where PM is standing in as the proxy for, that much more complex mixture. I do think we need to know that, but I don't think we're ever going to be able to measure formaldehyde at scale, at thousands of locations across North America or anything. So I think we need those things we know we can measure. We know we can measure at scale, and then those studies that help us understand how those proxies are representing the more complex mixture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, right? So from the policy standpoint, we've been stuck with total PM 2.5 mass for several decades because it's highly reproducible. It's more defendable. You can base your policy on that robust parameter. But on the other hand, we're struggling with understanding the differential toxicity of PM coming from size distribution, composition, all that. It's definitely a very complicated issue, and given wildfire is even more complicated given its episodic nature and then just this wild range of concentration levels. Okay. Next question I have is about the health impacts. Right? We Jen, you talked about it. Sarah and Minghao, you all touched upon the potential health impacts and the disease burden. So from your experience, what is the biggest lesson we have learned so far?
I don't know if this is the biggest lesson, but this is kind of tying in the exposure to the health impacts, is that we know that WUI fires are very, very different in composition than wildfires that don't burn man-made structures and things like that. And I think for us, that's kind of the new frontier, is understanding that better. So, I appreciate all the work that's going on, in the California-based study, but I think that is kind of our new frontier, and people are already starting to work on it. And I think moving forward, that's going to be more and more important, because the fires are getting bigger and reaching areas where they don't normally reach. And then we as humans are encroaching more and more into these wild areas that put, humans who cause a lot of the fires in direct contact with the fuel. So in my mind, that's kind of the new frontier. I feel like we already know a lot about wildfire smoke. We know that it's bad. I think that this is going to be kind of where we need to move into to really understand that, in addition to what are we actually being exposed to, because we do spend most of our time indoors. So kind of echoing everyone talking about the indoor question and how we haven't done a good job at getting at that piece yet.
I guess I completely agree with what Jen said. I think one additional piece that I think we're starting to sort of look into this is, so the wildfire smoke, the health impacts can be potentially different from other sources of PM for both the chemical composition, but also because sort of the exposure pattern, like how people get exposed to wildfire smoke, is very different from how people get exposed to other sources of PM. So I think Sarah mentioned this in her talk already. Wildfire smoke is very episodic. So, and this I think can go either way. So like in some of my colleagues' work, for instance, they do find their wildfire smoke sometimes has this sort of unexpected almost benefit, because it limits people's ability to go outdoors, or maybe they don't go outdoor as much. They don't break their leg playing baseball or basketball. That's sort of an unexpected benefit. But on the other hand, you do wonder, and I'm not the expert on this, is from a physiological perspective, that there are probably differences when you get exposed to this high level in a very short period of time, compared to if you're just living in a city, New York City or Vancouver, that you're sort of constantly exposed to those level of ambient pollution. So not sure which one is, this is definitely something I think needs more studying, but that's another, I think, big difference is that especially the social scientists have started to learn and investigate into the uniqueness of wildfire smoke.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Minghao.
Yeah, building on what Minghao said, I think one of the big questions is recovery time. because you can have a huge dose of exposure and then have nothing for a couple of years. So the magnitude of the dose probably different from background pollution, but then all of that recovery time might be helpful. This really hasn't been addressed yet. But back to the original question, for me, I think, again, kind of as a public health practitioner, the lesson is we can lean on what we already know. We have studied the health effects of air pollution for decades. So far, the health effects of wildfire smoke have been consistent with the literature, although the magnitude of impact seems to be different and often larger. So that is, we have used the evidence on decades, those decades worth of evidence to reduce exposure, regulatory control to gain benefits in the health of the population. We need to reduce population exposure to fire smoke to ensure that we can reduce health harms at the individual and population scale. How do we do it? So don't ignore, even though it's a different exposure, don't ignore 70 years of history since the London smog.
Thanks, Sarah. I'd love to continue this conversation, but in the interest of time, I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. I saw that Jen has already answered quite a few questions. Thanks a lot.
Oh, I didn't know we could do that.
There's this Q&A button. If you click on that, you see there are some questions Jen already answered, and then there are some fresh questions. I don't think I can sort them. I'll just go from, let's say, from the top, if I may. Kelly Gribben asked question, are environmental mixture methods being integrated into your work looking at associations between multiple pollutants and health outcomes? If so, please describe. And if not, can you elaborate on some of the barriers? Jen, you want to talk about it?
I'm happy to go first. So this is kind of a new area that I'm really trying to get into, really trying to get the funding to be able to do this. So myself, Yang, and others have put together a pending R01 looking at some of this very question, looking at environmental mixtures, but not just mixtures of pollutants, also mixtures of other environmental hazards. So often when people are being exposed to wildfire smoke, they're also being exposed to really hot days. So looking at some of those different mixtures and how those can come together, and then also then throwing in, some of the social determinants of health and those kinds of things. I think mixtures is a complicated, the statistics behind it is very complicated. So I think that's probably one of the barriers, but trying to push through that and get the money to be able to start looking at these.
Thanks, Jen. Next question, Justin Morrow. Are there new research tools or approaches needed for better understanding the variability of composition and hazard from wildfire smoke?
I can start. I think this can go in multiple directions, but I think one really exciting new research tools or approaches I look forward to integrate more into my research, and I know many people talk about this, is the next generation satellite capability of monitoring the different trace gases, and then the sort of different proxies for air pollution. Right? They're not they cannot substitute the surface measurement data, but because they can't really observe surface, but they can still include information that is relevant for different health metrics, right? Like one of the examples is the Temple satellite, which was launched, I think, 2023 or 2024. It was the first generation satellite data that both has a better spatial resolution, but also temporally, it's a geostationary satellite data, right? So you can repeatedly see a place during the daytime at least. So I think that will have a tremendous amount of power to sort of really help us understand the variability of those smoke. And this could potentially help with like some of the smaller fires, like the prescribed fires Jen was talking about, right? Because many of the time they were kind of small and they don't last more than a day. So we can't really see them using our previous generation, the satellite that can only see Earth one time a day. So I think that's going to be a potential game changer in help us understanding the wildfire smoke exposure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when we are looking at chronic health outcomes, I think we have to move beyond annual average as the metric of exposure, which has been used in kind of air pollution epidemiology, into tools like I talked about that are more flexibly understand the dynamic nature of the exposure. So, it could be that one really big dose of smoke can give you cancer 3 years down the line, but a small dose of smoke can't. And we need to understand, how magnitude matters, how frequency matters, how duration matters. So looking at the tools that we can use to do the epidemiology. And that's kind of a simple thing in the scheme of things. And building on what Minghao said, I think the full chemistry modeling is also getting pretty amazing as the computational power improves and as the models get better. There's a huge opportunity to blend those full chemistry models with the satellite data, as people are doing, to better understand those non-PM 2.5 components, because we can do everything with those types of tools and then start looking at that stuff we just can't measure at scale.
Yeah, kind of in conjunction with that, I think looking at different ways to measure this as well, because especially for things like mental health, the distance from the fire itself might have an impact on some of those things. So looking at, the number of consecutive days in the past year that you were exposed to smoke and some of those things that can kind of help us look at it slightly differently and maybe even enhance when we're looking at some of the longer term exposures that we're interested in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some limited work that uses kind of a smoke waves concept, right? That goes into duration, dose, intensity, frequency, all those different metrics than long-term average. Okay, so Saba Khan has a question. I joined late, but I was curious to know what's currently known about the health effects of wildfires on drinking water systems. We know a lot about air, but I think water is overlooked. Any thoughts?
First of all, I agree. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think there's two kind of major things to consider here. First is the direct impact of wildfire on water systems. And there's some great research out of California and other places showing, hot fires can melt pipes, and there's long-lasting harms to the infrastructure and the quality of the water coming from that infrastructure. And then you have the direct impact of the wildfire on the water itself. So the fact that it makes areas more prone to sliding, you get more material into the water, you get wildfire smoke landing on the water. There's a couple studies showing that wildfire smoke can lead to harmful algal freshwater blooms in areas that are impacted because they bring a lot of nutrition into the water. So it's a pretty complex area, not mine, but it is super important. I agree with Jen.
All right, we are at time. Let me thank all the panelists again for their excellent presentations and discussion. I'm sure you can find our contact information online or through Cafe. If you have any additional questions, feel free to drop us an email. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us